So welcome to the second part of our meeting, Rural Connective. This event is part of the, that's why probably you are on this side and the rest is on the other side. But thank you for coming and joining us for this reading, which will be given by Alyson, Hallett and Chris Caseldine, a poet and geographer, who together encountered Iceland, and we will have an occasion to listen to two voices speaking about that encounter. So thank you very much, Alyson and Chris, for coming here and giving us this reading. And please.
Before we start reading, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the project. This book came out of 6 Days in Iceland, and it's quite a nice follow-on from the theme of connectivity this afternoon, actually. I was poet in residence in the geography department at the University of Exeter on the Cornwall campus at Tremont, 2010 to 2011. And it came about through my knowing Annie, she was at the Paramansara project this afternoon, who introduced me to her supervisor, Kate Alyson. It was her who suggested that we make this residency happen. So that was an example of connectivity in practice. So anyway, there's a particular Leverhulme fund that puts artists in university departments that don't usually have artists in them, an artist in residence program. And we were lucky enough to get money for this, and I went off to be in a geography department where I felt incredibly at home. I was very welcomed by the geographers, the physical geographers and the human geographers. There was some mystification, certainly from some of the students who were thinking, you know, what on earth is a poet doing in our midst? We're here practicing science, not poetry. But this led to a lot of conversations, and that was one of the points, in a way, was for us to exchange ideas, to have discussions, and to see the different kinds of languages we use for talking about place and landscape. And in quite an interesting discussion one day with one of the PhD students, we realized that we both spent a lot of time observing the land and learning things and talking to people. And we then just use different languages to tell our stories about place, essentially. So it was largely an experiment. And as part of the year, I could go on a field trip, and I chose to go to Iceland with Chris, who's a physical geographer. And there was no remit whatsoever. I could just go along and hang out, basically. There were kind of targets and goals for the residency for the rest of the year, but there was nothing for this. And I ended up writing quite a lot of poetry. I took photos, and some of the students took photos as well. And when we came back, Chris suggested we make a book. And this is the result. So I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, it's just to say that as a scientist and a physical geographer, it was a bit odd to have a poet sitting there. I remember in my first lecture looking down at this poet and wondering, what's this poet going to do? Well, you know, sort of, I know what students do, but I said, what's she going to do? But it was, as the year progressed, Alyson morphed in the department very effectively, and then when she suggested coming on the field class, it seemed sensible. Students were slightly worried that they were going to have to do physical geography in the day and creative writing at night, and sort of be expected to be assessed on poetry, which would be a real problem for them. But the interesting thing was that they just sort of accepted, and we didn't put anything formal in, we just let the thing go. And I was there with an assistant, and the sort of classic example was my assistant and I were on this glacier, just in front of this glacier, with the students working around, mapping away, and Alyson coming up behind, and we said, well, what do poets do? What do we do? And there she was, doing exactly what you'd expect a poet to do. There was one rock, she was sitting on the rock, and she was going like this. And we said, don't disturb her. Whatever we do, don't disturb her. And then eventually she came up and we just had a chat, and that was it. And then afterwards, the poem that we're going to finish with, which is the sort of central poem, that's when that was written. So it actually explains exactly what I thought about poets. That's how they do it. They just sit there and it flows in. I wish I could have a similar sort of experience, but I'm afraid mine's a bit harder. But overall, and the interesting thing to finish it off was we launched the book with the students, and the students were absolutely delighted. It really enhanced their experience. And I think it comes out of something which sort of driven my feeling about this, is a wonderful book, Land of Ice and Fire, written in 1938 by Alyson, a Swedish glaciologist, who went out there on the glacier and actually wrote very strong scientific work. But halfway through it, you find this nice little comment. There's too much, all the natural science studies have predominated in the past. These, however, usually give only facts and results of a special kind, but not a picture of the whole, or the soul of that island in which human beings live a life of their own, cut off from the world. And in a way, that's what this is hopefully designed to do, to extend the basic geography that we know.
Okay. So what we're going to do in the first bit is just read some poems and some of the geographical text, and then we're going to read a much longer poem after that. There's one very long poem in the book, and we'll do that in the second part. So you're ready? Okay, the images have arrived, that's good. Okay, we're off. You ready?
Yeah.
Oh, and there'll be time for questions at the end, if you have any. Okay. Flood. And it all begins with that sound in spring. Drops falling off the glacier's edge. An echo of music waiting to be played.
Looking from Western Europe, Iceland is definitely north. Yet there's still a lot of latitude to go, as much as 25 degrees. The Arctic Circle barely touches the northernmost part of Iceland, the island of Grimsey off the north coast. Thus, from the perspective of the Arctic, Iceland is very much south, and Icelanders need to look to the north for all sorts of reasons.
Iceland Island. Yes, it was frightening there. It was young there, hidden, raw, like being in the mouth of a lion. Ice so luminous, there on the black beach. It was creaturely, alive as it pursued its path to the sea. Land of fire, fire underfoot, under peak, under ice. Water boiling out of the earth. Never tasted air like that. Sometimes sulphur, sometimes so fresh my lungs turned blue and pinned their flags to the mountains.
Glaciers are divided into two units, separated by an imaginary line known as the equilibrium line. Above this line, the glacier accumulates, below it melts or ablates. Above it grows, below it declines. This simple distinction also governs another important feature of glaciers. Accumulation leads to movement into the ice, which means that anything taken up by the ice, including rocks and bodies, will flow into it. Melting leads to the movement out of the ice. Moraines, the dumps of rocks and sediments excavated and transported by the ice, can similarly only be found around the lower limits of ice. They do not appear at higher levels where snow and ice accumulate.
Swimming pool, Reykjavik, 1st of April. At a temperature of 1 degree, we see our breath in air. Steam rises from geothermal pools. The water sees its breath too.
Ice is a plastic substance, although this is not altogether obvious from the apparently brittle nature of a crevassed glacier surface. Ice deforms and creeps and moves as much by deformation as by sliding or slipping. In Iceland, where glaciers are defined as temperate, they have a warm base due to the pressure melting of ice as it overlies the surface over which it flows. There are indeed some glaciers that are actually known as cold because they are frozen to their bed, but not in Iceland.
Thinking of Iceland. Chris counsels us to think of Iceland as flat. Even the mountains are flat, he says, when you see them as layer upon layer of lava. generations of flatness inhabited by trolls, outcrops of horizontal time. Then he counsels us to think south, not north, to unhitch the island from a European mind, connect it with the Arctic's southernmost tip. We place ourselves there, the sea's currents fat with cod, herring, radioactivity from decommissioned warships.
The nature of the Icelandic physical landscape is largely driven by horizontality. Over its short geological history, Iceland has been built up by successive outpourings of lava, now largely seen as horizontally bedded basalts, sandwiching remains of former glacial deposits left by ice sheets and ice caps of various sizes. Because of the action of ice and rivers, the horizontal strata are cut by deeply incised glacial and fluvial valleys. This reveals the past at the surface and allows us to interpret the geological history of the island.
April in Iceland. Resurrection. Dead grass reconsiders life. Redwings arrive. Snow scripts the hills, a language hewn out of ice. The sun's handwriting, spill of white. Redwings unflinching as people pass by.
Iceland lies across one of the main outlets of the largely landlocked Arctic Ocean, so anything entering the ocean north of Russia may find its way south around the Icelandic coast. This includes useful items, such as driftwood, prized in earlier times for building houses and ships, as well as less welcome material, such as nuclear waste associated with the sinking of Soviet naval vessels in the Arctic Ocean north of Russia. The drift ice has also brought with it polar bears, useful in providing highly valued skins for export in earlier times, but now killed immediately on landfall to protect the sparsely settled areas around the northwest in particular.
We meet whatever we need to meet. The moment when a car, bus, cyclist, and 2 running dogs cross paths, the road otherwise empty for hundreds of miles. The moment when stones look down as we look up. Law rock, one stone clasped like a jewel at the top. The moment when a town issues a sudden apology for existing, each building an excuse me for its brief appearance. The moment when snow melts and carries away a road, when geysers publish their skyward bulletins. The moment when nothing seems to grow on the maddening plains. A few horses, a house, a pylon. And then those 2 swans flying over, banking to the right, 4 white wings beating air.
Flood. And it all begins with that sound in spring. Drops falling off the glacier's edge. An echo of music waiting to be played.
So that's the first little section. In terms, I was trying to think of how we might link this with any kind of technology. And when we first launched the book at Tremo, there was a Chinese scholar, wasn't there, one of your colleagues, who had a friend visiting from Beijing? And he took it upon himself to translate the little poem about the swimming pool in Reykjavik, and he put it up on his website. And for some reason it went completely viral. He then put up poems in English from the book for other people to try and translate, and he was getting tens of thousands of people coming in and translating the poems. So that was quite an interesting. And he came to the launch and read one of the poems in Mandarin. So,
and in fact, he read it in more than one Mandarin, didn't he?
Yes, he did. He read it in an
at least several
old-fashioned.
different translations that people had done.
So that was
all very
quite
strange.
an exciting example. And the next poem we're going to read, I'm going to try and explain the strange, synchronous events that came about after writing it, which means I need to tell you two what are going to appear to be completely unrelated stories. But bear with me for a moment. So 3-4 years ago, I was in Sydney in Australia. And whilst I was there, I went to some poetry readings, and I got in contact with somebody from something called the Poets Union, just asking him where the readings were that I could go to. And he emailed me. And then there was one that I went to that he wasn't at, and then one he went to that I wasn't at. So we never met in Australia, even though we'd exchanged emails. And several years later, when he came to England, he was from England, but he'd emigrated there a long time ago. He came to visit me in Hartland when I lived in North Devon. And he was very interested in geography. He'd been a geography teacher all his life. So we had this strange contact. So that's the first story. The second story is, fast forward to when I go to Iceland, and we're in a museum near a glacier. I realize we've got a potato. I call them glaciers, you call them glaciers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Going on. And there was one very, very moving exhibit where there'd been a field trip to Iceland in the 50s, and 2 of the students had never come back. And although the remains of their tent and various other things have been found, their bodies have never ever reappeared. And I write about this in the poem. And when we finished the book, I sent the poems to the man in Australia that I never met in Australia, but who'd come to Devon. And it turned out that they were 2 of his best friends. And he'd studied with them in Nottingham. And this led to a whole series of things happening whereby the book ended up going to Nottingham. Various archives were kind of excavated. And I suppose the memories of these 2 young men have come back to life in some way. And I've since been sent quite a lot of material from Thomas in Australia, photographs of these young men and various obituaries. So there's another piece of work waiting to happen with it. But I think when you work with place, or when you're immersed in place and you respond to it, you maybe become involved in a whole network of things that you have no idea about, that are going on all these different levels. That's maybe enough. So we're going to read you the long poem.
Do you need to explain the German?
Oh, and it's called Atlas of Iceland in 19 pages. And fear not, the 19 pages are not all A4 size pages. Some of them are just a few lines. And it's dedicated to Herman Dates, the father of a very good friend of mine who died just when we came back from Iceland. And he was a map maker in the Andes. He was one of the first men who went off into the Andes in Argentina on the back of a mule for many months on end, mapping places where no one had mapped before. So the poem's dedicated to him and connects us with the memories of these 2 young men and everybody who knew them, I suppose. Atlas of Iceland in 19 pages. I move a stone and everything changes. Me, the stone, the earth that held the stone, water that runs through earth, root of birch, mash of moss, lichen. The map undulates across this frozen land. Behind us, in the retreating ice, 2 dead bodies are waiting to be delivered. They say a glacier gives back the things it takes, that it will not hold them forever.
So far, this one, at Skaftafell, has given the remains of a tent, 2 backpacks, 1 pair of trousers, 1 pair of socks, ski bindings, wood from the skis, pan and handle, hammerhead, crampons, goggles, spanner, toothbrush. It has not yet given Ian Harrison and Tony Prosser, students from Nottingham University, doing fieldwork in 1953. It has so far refused to relinquish their bodies.
If they come, they will be midwifed by sun, the sun's heat winnowing ice to water, and they will be midwifed by movement, deforming ice pouring down the mountain like treacle. Francesca says, what if Catlet explodes while we're here? What if a flood comes down off the mountain? What if we can't escape?
No brakes strong enough to stop the flood. Here, in the clean air of the mountains, we learn that we are able to die.
The stone dies to the life it was leading each time we move it. The day dies each time the light falls away. Each learning of dying presses us into the passion of life, this breath, this urgent now. We will all grow old in different ways.
Bodies in ice.
Hooper swans who mate for life.
Moss, stones, moraines.
The northern lights will grow old, and the young lava that comes to cover land will be made of old things rekindled in fire.
These maps, these gyres of place, position, elevation, are already out of date.
The sun is coming upon the mountain.
The ice is deforming.
A single duck, then raven, flies over. You cannot mistake the shape of the glacier when seen from above. A tongue, a white tongue. It pours down the mountain. It creaks as it moves. And soon this melt will spell something new into the language of its body.
Flood is another word for the music of water.
Out here, in this clean air, by this high mountain, with swan-white snow, the sound of melting ice, like the sound stars might make if we could hear them.
Out here, where the great black plains stretch for miles to the sea, 5 swans, then 5 geese fly by.
Out here, surrounded by ice and stone, the dead stalks of lupins and the glance of cloud-muted light. Out here, I can say who I am.
Yes, I'm frightened. Yes, I'm full of dread. Yes, the land is indifferent to its warm-blooded guests.
Stuck to a stone, my bones sore from so long sitting.
Who knows what we will take home from here?
Measurements, samples, data, stones, stories of volcanic eruptions, eruptions of our own. Heat percolates beneath the ice. Mountains hide inside the earth. A future of unerupted lava waits inside the volcano.
Seen from above, the ice field is a tongue. There are no fields in Iceland. There is land and farms and barns. They say the glacier gives back everything it takes.
Our footsteps, then, are included in its inventory. The dig of crampons, the reverberating step, sound waves of our voices. All of these have been taken into the house of blue ice. One day, the glacier will give everything back. That is said, not written, and sayings are as fluid as water itself.
We are not so different, we and our world. Nature massed as moss on stone, maps, measurements, an atlas of moraines. These readings of land are reading of ourselves.
In the library of fire and water, we are all forming and deforming. Brittle bones, brittle rocks. Only the spirit plastic enough to unstitch time. Thank you for your patience. Did we not get to the end? I'm aware I'm becoming more and more husky.
Struggling.
So please now it's time to ask questions.
Or get more wine.
No,
or
sure.
both.
How did you think the physical geography changed you?
How did it change me?
Oh dear.
I'm a human geographer.
Do you want me to go out of the room?
How did it...
Could you reflect on that experience?
I suppose it took me to places I otherwise wouldn't have gone, and it helped me to see things that I otherwise might not have looked at. Hours and hours on the edge of a moraine, measuring. I helped some of the students when they were measuring, and just, seeing the edge of a glacier and watching it drip and just knowing that as the edge and learning about things like tephra. And I suppose some of the elements and compositions of landscape that I maybe would have read about in a book, but it's so different when you hear it and when it's given to you and you then go out and you touch it and you're with it and you're breathing it. And having somebody that I could ask questions and I would get an answer that was informed by experiments and studies that, have been going on for a very long time. So it gave me, I guess it gave me access to a library of information. And I think what I ended up seeing was the connection. There was a lot of passion. That's what I found in a lot of the geography as well. That real love of being with the land and the stones. And I'm not sure I was expecting that. I don't know if I'd kind of naively thought that was more the terrain of artistic endeavour, but just so much passion and care. And in that sense, and I guess particularly going, because you've been to Iceland so many times, and so the knowledge has accrued over decades, and you care about it so deeply. So it gave me that. It gave me a whole load of things, but they're the things that come to the surface to begin with. And that was really exciting, to see the bits that were similar. There were bits I didn't understand as well. It gave me things that were incomprehensible, the kind of second hour of a lecture about tephra, and I'm kind of going, okay, this isn't going to become my speciality, but it's good to find those edges, the bits that are interesting, the bits where I want to read something else. Yeah.
Chris, basically that's really beautiful. I kind of wanted to ask you that I realised it in the first section, for instance, that we were reading Alyson written for a poem, and seeing that we were talking about the poem. And has the presence of having a poet made you pay attention to the way you talk, or so that it becomes more voiceful, or does the juxtaposition itself create poetry from about your description?
I hope not, in one sense. In that I'm not. I think it depends where you are. In that the text that was written for this is always classified as scientific text. In one sense, it's not. I found it the most difficult stuff to write that I'd ever written, because you'd have to get through Alyson for a start, which is a very tough critic. So we had this idea, and I just came up with 5 parts. I don't know where it came from. 5 parts. The things that were sort of central, that also fitted, because my text came after her poetry. Because we'd seen quite a few of the poems, and she picked up things that I'd used and ideas that I'd used. And these are ideas that I developed over quite a few years with students, trying to get them to think. So when I was writing stuff for this, I was trying to be as sort of spare and scientific as I could be, without trying to be too scientific. So, and it was hard, because I would go off. It was fun, it's very interesting. We ought to write a bit more about this. I want a bit more about, no, you can't have those lines. You get rid of those lines. And so, so I wouldn't use that with students, but what I would do in the field is to try and, what I think Alyson's very good at with doing this, is picking on the things that you use to get an idea. A few words, outcrops of horizontal time. Things like that, actually sort of percolate an idea and say, right, that's an idea that I can get out without having to tell them you will learn this. So in that sense, the language changes, the presentation changes. But I also think, and you may have a different view, that my whole teaching has changed over the years, because I've got very much older, in recognise, I think the older you get, the more you realise the less you're getting through to students, and therefore you have to sort of think of what it is that students really want. And it's quite interesting how these days this sort of exercise, you can pick up 3 or 4 ideas and you really feel we've cracked it because we've got those ideas across. So I think the advantage is this verbosity of language that academics can use, because on paper somebody bothers what they do, but they're not too worried. Whereas in this you can't. Language is more important. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's sort of thinking.
I'm not sure how long you wrote for, but obviously Iceland is a very demanding landscape. And I'd just be interested to hear when your most creative times were, and the kind of ebb and flow of travel through a harsh landscape like that, and what kind of inspired you during those moments, and where you drew inspiration from that.
Heathrow Airport. Or Renaissance Hotel. I mean, it's all the time.
It did start at the Renaissance Hotel in Heathrow Airport. We went for 6 days, which is a very short space of time, which is why I think on the back of the book we say it's an invitation to the various Icelands we met. So it's not like a definitive, this is Iceland, it's just this tiny glimpse. But yeah, in the hotel on the way, there was this extraordinary platter behind the reception desk, this beautiful piece of rock on it. Was it full of mica? It was glittering. And of course I was like, what is that? And it reminded me of John the Baptist's head, you know, which was lopped off and put on a platter, and there was this magnificent piece of rock that was, you know, just sitting there grandly. And it was from the volcano that exploded in Iceland, whose name you can pronounce very well, I can't.
Yeah, 50.
So that was the beginning, and I think, one of the luxuries for me as a writer, and I don't know if the other writers in this room agree, is when there's absolutely no pressure to do anything. So nobody had said to me, you must come back with a definitive poem about Iceland, or you must describe a glacier. There was nothing. If I'd come back having written nothing, that would have been okay. And so, of course, with that kind of permission, it means something just opens up. And I had no pattern whatsoever. I didn't think, I know I will get up every morning and write. I wrote when and where I felt like it. So one evening, there's a poem in here called Night, Iceland. And one evening I just thought I'd see what it was like to walk into the darkness. So I left it. We were in a hotel, and there was a little kind of garage opposite, but that was it for hundreds of miles probably, wasn't it? So I went out the back and started walking up towards the glacier, which was quite scary. The sound of the waterfalls was very loud, and then the blackness was so intense. And so I suppose very often I'll have an experience and then I'll write. I don't know if it was that night or the night after, but I did quite a lot of writing there, at the time when I got stuck on the rock. And that was that ended up being the 19 pages in Iceland. You know, there's so much surprise. You sit down and you're going, and even when I came back, I didn't know if I had poems that I just put in the bin, or ones that I might work on. So I think being given the liberty to do nothing actually meant that I did quite a lot as and when I felt like it, and I'm not the kind of person who takes a notebook with me everywhere I go. So I wasn't jotting on the buses or anything. It would kind of probably more likely be in the morning or late at night, or if I woke up in the night. Maybe a couple when I came back. But I took notes of what had been delivered from the glacier, because I just remember with that exhibit. So there's all different bits and ways of putting it together. Just like go some ways, it was completely mystifying what I do. But it was a real luxury not to have to do anything. That was a real gift. And you know, it was a complete surprise to then make the book that had not been part of the plan of the residency at all.
Was your first experience of collaborating alongside
with an artist. One of the advantages of being at Tremo is that we've got cultural human geographers who are, I would describe them scientifically as off the wall, in that I have great difficulty in sometimes understanding them, but I'm beginning to sort of get through their opacity and actually sort of understand a little bit where they're coming from. And I actually had a year and a half, 2 years on a network that ran from there, which had started to bring in poems. In fact, the design of the book, the actual way this was laid out, and although we produced it, it was actually produced by Colin Sack, who produces books for all sorts of things, and he was part of this network and doing, because I contributed to another book, which is pretty sort of non-scientific, and that was interesting because you suddenly do sort of think, does it matter? I mean, if we went through the times that, you know, the spacing and the font and the what goes where, and the photographs in the middle, we got 14 photographs out of heaven knows how many, which were just selection from Alyson herself, one of the students, two of the students in particular. And I just looked at these and I thought, oh, that's a nice set, we'll have those. Oh, no, you can't have that. You know, we've got to put... So basically, we spent hours where I'd say that's it, and Alyson would come along and say, no, that doesn't go there, that doesn't go there. So they went in the bin. Then we'd arrange them in a line, and I was, that's fine. You know, and Alyson, no, that's not right. and then, you know, the next day to come, oh no, it's moved. I had a thought. I think I might move that one to there, move that one there. And it's a totally different way. I don't understand it. I mean, I can sort of understand it to a level, but I can't, I find it, and I like the collaboration, I love it. I've learnt a lot. I can't say what I've learnt. That's being rude, no. In tangible terms, it's very difficult to explain what I've learnt, but I feel very different about my attitude to those things. And I think that's the advantage of a collaboration whereby you just get on. But you don't try and sort of understand too much what the other person's doing, perhaps. You just sort of go with it. I think. I still don't like that one with the bear on it.
I hated that one.
I hate
Oh,
that.
good grief.
It just offends my sensibilities with the whole thing, but no, it's
I love it.
yeah. Well, absolutely. It's top of your list. And it was off in the bin. So I was going to say.
Would you recommend
I think it's really useful because I work in climate change, and it's interesting how if you look at the material there, the science of climate change is an issue, is good, very good science, etc., etc. But if there are one or two people writing now that actually, in terms of understanding, we need to look at interdisciplinarity, we need to look at a whole range of issues well beyond science, culture, ideas, the whole lot, and especially to communicate those ideas. And I think what this sort of work can do is communicate ideas and thoughts in a way that is very different from just standing up and giving information. And everybody takes a different thing from it. And I think we tend perhaps to think that we have a message that you want to get out and that there is a single message and it's in a box and you tick the box. And for universities you tick the box to say, is it good enough to be allowed in the university sort of thing. Whereas the reality of it is, and I think this is what I've learned with the students, is that you put these ideas out there in different ways and different people take it in different ways and they get something different from it. And this came out when the students came to the reading, when we launched it, at the wine afterwards, and it wasn't just the wine. Where, you know, students who I would have said were total geography students, quite strongly geography, you know, do it that way, and not quite your geography teacher style, but, you know, sort of closely bounded, if you like, or what they did. And they just said, I love it. That poem there, this poem there, that just means so much more. And they just, you know, I didn't get it in finals papers, sort of little quotes coming in or anything like that. But they'd taken away an experience which was different, but was complementary to what they'd had. So I think, if it worked, it worked. I think we had a good canvas to work on, and we got on, and sort of had ideas, and didn't interfere with each other. Well, which you do. I mean, it's not really like lots of sentences which came out, but I mean, we didn't sort of formally sort of interfere and say, how about doing this or how about doing that? We did it.
I was struck by when you asked Chris to pronounce the name of the mountain. I'm struggling for reference here. There's that notion of the total quality of the language emerges from the relationship that humans have with the physical landscape. And I just wondered whether you'd ever sort of toyed with the idea of incorporating some of the quality of the Icelandic language into what you're doing, whether you really kind of thought of that as something to play with.
No. Do you mean in terms of using Icelandic words, or
possibly, or even something like the quality of the way a language sounds, and how that has relationships with people and landscape, I suppose.
Can you give me an example? Do you mean me trying to sound like an Icelander?
No. I mean, it's just the kind of the theory, the notion that, you know, the total quality of, say French, very broad terms, might reflect the way that people have engaged with the landscape, and likewise, you know, differences, say, between the Scottish accents and Southern English accents might reflect the kind of the human history of engagement with the landscape.
I mean, if I was going to do that, then I'd be quoting from the Icelandic sagas. I mean, in the space of 6 days, or even writing when I come back. I mean, that's, for me, not long enough. I mean, if I'm there, I'm using my body, my whole sense, as a kind of barometer or transmitter, if you like. But if I wanted to include more of that, then I would go to the sagas and I would start quoting from them. There's a great quote at the beginning of the book, actually, because I think it's quite problematic if you're using dialogues. I mean, there's so much politics around language, and I don't know the politics in Iceland, but certainly in this country. I mean, it's changed a lot now in the way that dialects are seen, but I don't want to fetishise that. And, you know, the language is very, very political, and I wouldn't be confident after a very short space of time to start trying to say, well, I'm using an Icelandic tonality. I don't know it. I didn't speak with enough Icelandic people to hear that I don't speak Icelandic. For me, there would be a whole load of issues that would take a lot of research and thinking and conversation for me to work myself through that kind of ethically, as well as in terms of what might fit into a piece of work, particularly in the context of writing in English, which for me is fraught with problems and questions around dialect and how we write, you know, because we write in a way often that doesn't reflect how a word will sound. And, you know, it's changed a lot, particularly in Scotland. I suppose a lot of work has been done on that. But I think we're still in the early days of living with quite a degree of fascism around language. But anyway, I'm just going to read you the quote from the beginning, which is really lovely. And I got this from a wonderful journal called Topos. I don't know if you know Topos. It's a landscape architecture journal. They have some great articles. In Icelandic, we don't talk about cultivating the soil. And here I am actually going to try and pronounce some of Icelandic badly. We say adjurka jardina. The verb adjurka means to write poetry. When we put seeds into the soil, we therefore tend to think of it as making poems from the soil. We are making poetry of the land. We are writing the land. And when we pick flowers, we call it ad lesa blom. The verb lesa means to read. We are reading the flowers. I love that quote. So, you know, if you take on a tonality, you're taking on a whole history. You're taking on such a complexity. And I didn't have the confidence or inclination to go there in that short space of time. Good question.
Any more questions?
Well, if
I just wanted to ask, very short, it can either be a yes or a no.
Oh, okay.
And that is, did any of the students write imaginatively when you were there?
not that I know of, but that's not to say that they didn't.
Yeah.
So I didn't.
They weren't encouraged to, but I wondered if anyone else had.
They were so fantastically busy. I mean, the student experience has really changed. I mean, every night, even though there was a bar, we were in the adjacent room being worked until about 11 o'clock at night with them all giving presentations. So it was phenomenal.
Very expensive,
In the bar, in the hotel it wasn't too bad, but they were so busy working,
Yeah.
there wasn't time to drink. But one of your students had wanted to major in English. He was a particular fan of Byron and loved poetry, and he'd gone down the geography route because he thought he might be more likely to get a job afterwards, which is probably very true. So, you know, I did meet some of the students who had a love of poetry already, but whether or not they were writing, I don't know. They may be writing now for all we know, because they all got a book, so maybe they've gone away and they've started. You know, some people write in secret, don't they?
I mean, it's fair to say we didn't encourage them, we didn't prevent them, but because we were separate and there was the academic side of it, we didn't sort of say, right, if you want to try anything, you know, Alyson was here. So in that sense, we weren't encouraging, we were just letting the thing run as it ran. So, and they wouldn't have had a lot of time, to be honest. Yeah.
But I mean, it's always the interesting thing where you never know, do you, often until years later. And you know, when I look back at things that were really important to me or influenced me, often I didn't know at the time. And I'm thinking of even the year that I was in the department, and I read poems in some lectures. I'd go to some seminars and read, and you never know. You know, when a seed gets planted, you never know at what point a sprout or a little shoot may come from it. Maybe 4 years down the line, one of you picks up a pen. Or so. In the first instance, no, not that I know of. In the second instance, maybe. Yeah, that would be quite an interesting thing to know. Maybe. Yeah.
Sorry, thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you.
Thank you for being so attentive.
Chris, and